Bristol, Pennsylvania, 1962. A quiet town, a small church, and a little girl who never made it home from the library. Her name was Carol Ann Dougherty, 9 years old. What happened inside St. Mark's Church that night shattered a family and silenced a community for more than 60 years. But the truth buried under decades of dust and denial has finally been revealed. This is the case that haunted an entire town. Welcome back to Cold Case Desk, where we uncover stories that time refused to forget. In today's episode, we revisit one of the most haunting unsolved murders in Pennsylvania history, a case that went cold for more than 6 decades before the truth finally surfaced. This is the story of 9-year-old Carol Ann Dougherty, a bright and joyful child from Bristol, Pennsylvania, whose life was stolen in the fall of 1962 inside a place that should have been her sanctuary, a local church. For over 63 years, her family, her community, and generations of investigators would be haunted by one question: who could commit such an unthinkable act? And finally, in 2023, that question was answered. In the early 1960s, Bristol was the kind of small American town where everyone knew each other. Nestled in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, it was a community filled with modest row homes, friendly faces, and a sense of safety. Families gathered for Sunday services at St. Mark's Church, children played in the streets, and parents rarely worried about danger. For the Dougherty family, this sense of peace was part of their daily life. Carol Ann, the oldest of 3 siblings, loved school, music, and reading. On October 22, 1962, a Monday afternoon that began like any other, Carol Ann hopped on her bicycle and headed toward the local library, just a few blocks away. She told her parents she'd meet some friends there, a routine errand for a girl her age in a town like Bristol. But this time, she never made it home. As the autumn sun dipped below the horizon, dinner time came and went. Carol Ann's parents, worried by her absence, began to search the neighborhood. Neighbors joined in, calling her name down quiet streets and alleyways. The small town that usually closed its doors by dusk was suddenly wide awake. Hours passed. There was no sign of the little girl. Then, her father made a discovery no parent should ever have to face. Inside St. Mark's Church, a place that had once brought the family comfort and faith, he found his daughter's body brutally attacked and left in the church choir loft. The sanctuary that had been sacred for the family now became a scene of horror and grief. News of Carol Ann's murder spread quickly through Bristol. Fear replaced trust, and silence fell over the small community. Parents kept their children indoors. The church bells that once symbolized peace now seemed to echo loss. Police swarmed the scene. Detectives combed through every corner of St. Mark's, the pews, the choir stands, the confessionals looking for clues. Evidence collection in 1962 was limited by the science of the time, but officers gathered what they could: fibers, fingerprints, and samples they hoped would one day tell the story of what happened. They interviewed everyone: priests, church staff, parishioners, and neighbors. Suspicions circled around several local men. Among them was William Schrader, a 22-year-old who lived only a block and a half from the church. William Schrader was questioned shortly after the murder. Investigators noted inconsistencies in his story. He provided a pubic hair sample, which was compared to those found at the scene but without the benefit of modern DNA analysis. Results were inconclusive. He denied involvement, claiming he had been elsewhere that night, but detectives found holes in his alibi. Even so, in the chaos of a high-profile investigation and mounting public pressure, police shifted their focus toward other suspects, 3 men who, for years, remained under scrutiny. Meanwhile, William Schrader quietly left town. He moved south, far from Pennsylvania, settling eventually in Louisiana. To the people of Bristol, he was just another name that faded from the headlines. But as later evidence would show, his departure was no coincidence, and his life after Bristol would reveal a disturbing pattern of abuse and violence. For the Dougherty family, time did not heal. Carol Ann's younger sister, Kay, was only a child when tragedy struck. As she grew older, she carried the weight of unanswered questions, watching as decades passed and investigators came and went. Every so often, hope would rise, a new detective taking interest, a new piece of evidence re-examined, but nothing ever seemed to break the wall of silence that had formed around the case. The years rolled into decades. The 1970s, the 1980s, the 1990s. Carol Ann's name appeared occasionally in local newspapers, a reminder of the town's deepest wound, but for the most part, the case sat in the archives of Bucks County, gathering dust. Still, her family never stopped waiting for justice. Even as generations changed, Bristol never forgot the tragedy that took place inside St. Mark's Church. Residents who had been children in 1962 still remembered their parents' fear. Some avoided the church altogether. Others visited the site quietly, leaving flowers in the shadows. Among them was Mike Missinelli, a radio personality and cousin of Bristol's police chief at the time of the crime. Decades later, long after the official investigation had gone cold, Missinelli would revisit the story in his own way. He launched a podcast dedicated to the unsolved case, hoping to bring attention back to Carol Ann's story and perhaps, at long last, help her family find closure. Little did anyone know, his timing would be perfect. By the early 1990s, forensic technology had advanced dramatically. DNA profiling was revolutionizing the way cold cases were solved. Investigators reopened Carol Ann's case, this time testing 141 hair samples collected from men in the area over the years. One by one, suspects were eliminated until only one remained, William Schrader. But despite this striking result, the evidence still wasn't strong enough to bring formal charges. The technology could confirm that Schrader's hair was consistent, but not conclusively identify him as the killer. It was another near miss in a case already defined by heartbreak. Even so, this new clue reignited interest within Bucks County law enforcement. Files were revisited. Old evidence was re-examined. The name William Schrader began to surface again, this time with renewed scrutiny. As investigators dug deeper into Schrader's life after he fled Pennsylvania, what they uncovered was deeply disturbing. In Louisiana, Schrader had built a new life, but one that hid a dark truth. Reports and testimonies revealed a history of sexual abuse against young girls, including within his own family. Those who had known him described him as manipulative and controlling. Decades later, his own stepson would come forward with information that would change everything. In interviews conducted by investigators, Schrader's stepson revealed that Schrader had confessed twice, saying he had murdered a little girl in a Pennsylvania church. This was the breakthrough the case had been waiting for. Armed with new witness testimony and decades of accumulated evidence, the Bucks County District Attorney's Office assembled a grand jury to review the case. Prosecutors presented every detail: the crime scene evidence, the failed alibis, the forensic testing, and now the confession from Schrader's stepson. Piece by piece, the puzzle finally came together. In 2023, after 63 years, the grand jury reached its conclusion. William Schrader, who had died in 2002, was identified as the man responsible for the rape and murder of 9-year-old Carol Ann Dougherty. For the Dougherty family, it was a verdict that came too late for justice in court, but not too late for peace. After more than 6 decades of silence, the truth had finally been spoken. Even though the man responsible could no longer face trial, the acknowledgement of what truly happened allowed the family and the town of Bristol to finally exhale. Before we continue, if you're moved by the story and believe cold cases like Carol Ann's deserve to be told, like, comment, and hit the subscribe button to join us here at Cold Case Desk. The 1960s in America were an era of change, but for the small town of Bristol, Pennsylvania, life seemed to stand still after that October night in 1962. A little girl was gone, and the heart of the community never fully recovered. The police chief at the time promised justice. Detectives swore they would not rest until the killer was found. But as the days turned into weeks and then months, the investigation began to lose momentum. In an era before DNA, before computerized databases, before cold case units even existed, detectives relied on interviews, fingerprints, and intuition. The truth was buried in the evidence they already had. They just didn't have the tools to see it. After Carol Ann's body was found in the church, the Bristol Police Department immediately called in help from Bucks County authorities. Dozens of officers worked around the clock. They searched through every corner of the church, spoke with parishioners, and questioned neighbors who might have seen anything unusual. But fear had already taken hold. People were afraid to speak. Some thought the killer might still be among them, perhaps even someone they saw at Sunday Mass. Officers took statements from potential suspects and required several men in the neighborhood to provide hair samples. One of those men was William Schrader. At that time, nothing tied him directly to the crime. With no eyewitnesses, no confession, and no clear forensic match, the investigation stalled. Meanwhile, the Dougherty family was left in silence, grieving not only the loss of their daughter, but the absence of answers. Carol Ann's parents were never the same. The tragedy tore through the family like a storm that would not pass. Her father, the man who had found her, carried that image with him for the rest of his life. Her mother, once known for her gentle kindness, withdrew from the world. And little Kay, Carol Ann's younger sister, grew up in the long shadow of that night. Every holiday, every family photo, every visit to St. Mark's Church reminded them of what had been stolen. As years went on, neighbors moved away, police officers retired, and the files were eventually boxed up and placed in the archives. But even then, the case was never forgotten. It lingered a painful echo through the decades. By the 1970s, Bristol had changed. The children who had once ridden bikes past the church were grown. The streets had aged, but the wound remained. Investigators occasionally reopened the files, rereading old reports and examining evidence that had long since gone stale. There were moments of renewed hope, rumors of breakthroughs, whispers of suspects, but each time the case slipped back into silence. The 1980s brought new techniques to forensics, but resources were limited, and older cases often took a back seat to the present. For Carol Ann's family, time felt like a cruel enemy. Still, Kay never gave up. As an adult, she became the voice of her sister's memory, writing letters, attending vigils, and urging investigators not to forget. She once described it as a wound that never healed, and that wound kept the case alive in the hearts of those who remembered her. The early 1990s brought a new era to criminal investigations. DNA technology was beginning to transform the justice system. In 1993, investigators made a decision that would mark the turning point for Carol Ann's case. They collected and tested 141 hair samples from men who had lived near the church at the time of the murder or had been considered persons of interest. Each sample was examined and compared using the latest available methods. One by one, they were eliminated until only one remained that could not be ruled out. That man was William Schrader. He had long since left Pennsylvania. Investigators learned that he had settled in Louisiana, where he lived quietly. Though the forensic results were promising, the technology still wasn't advanced enough to prove guilt beyond doubt. It was a lead, but not the breakthrough they needed. So once again, the case went quiet. William Schrader's life after leaving Bristol was one marked by secrecy and control. To the outside world, he appeared to be an ordinary man working, raising a family, blending into small-town life in Louisiana. But behind closed doors, he was something far darker. Over the years, allegations of abuse surfaced within his own household. Family members described him as volatile and manipulative, a man capable of cruelty without remorse. Decades later, after Schrader's death in 2002, members of his own family would begin to speak about what they had endured. Among them was his stepson, who would ultimately hold the key to unlocking the truth about what happened in 1962. In 2022, as investigators in Bucks County once again reviewed their backlog of unsolved cases, they reopened the file on Carol Ann Dougherty. By then, many of the original detectives had passed away. But the new generation of investigators had better tools, better science, and one crucial thing: persistence. They decided to follow up on a lead that had been largely overlooked: Schrader's family in Louisiana. When detectives contacted Schrader's stepson, what he told them would send chills through the room. He revealed that, years earlier, Schrader had confessed not once, but twice, to murdering a little girl in a Pennsylvania church. He said Schrader described it in disturbing detail, speaking as though it were a secret he could no longer keep. The stepson had lived with that knowledge for years, unsure of what to do, until investigators reached out. It was the missing piece of the puzzle. The Bucks County District Attorney's Office, led by District Attorney Jennifer Shorn, took immediate action. The evidence, both old and new, was carefully reassembled. Every document, every photo, every sample, all were revisited. Prosecutors worked alongside forensic experts and cold case detectives, building a timeline that stretched across 6 decades. They confirmed that Schrader had lived just a block and a half from St. Mark's Church at the time of the murder. They confirmed that he had been questioned, that his alibi had been false, and that his hair sample had never been eliminated. And now, they had his own confession through a family witness. For investigators who had inherited a case older than many of them were alive, this was a powerful moment. The evidence they had preserved, despite years of dust and decay, had finally told its story. The district attorney's office presented the findings to a grand jury, which reviewed the entire history of the case. Over several months, witnesses testified, records were analyzed, and experts explained the evolution of forensic science that made this conclusion possible. The grand jury ultimately ruled that William Schrader had raped and murdered 9-year-old Carol Ann Dougherty on that October day in 1962. Though Schrader had been dead for more than 20 years, the determination brought something that had eluded the family for generations: truth. When the verdict was read, those who had carried Carol Ann's memory for so long wept quietly. It was not celebration. It was not relief. It was something deeper, a closure. For Kay, Carol Ann's sister, the moment was overwhelming. She had waited more than 60 years to hear her sister's name spoken in court again. In public statements, she expressed gratitude for the investigators who refused to let the case fade, and to the prosecutors who gave her family the truth they had sought for decades. For the town of Bristol, the announcement reopened old wounds, but it also allowed healing to finally begin. For the first time, they could speak about the tragedy without fear or uncertainty. The story of Carol Ann Dougherty had come full circle. When a crime goes unsolved for decades, it's easy to believe that time will erase it. But as this case shows, time doesn't erase, it reveals. It reveals what remains hidden. It reveals the truth that refuses to die. And in the end, truth was all that Carol Ann's family ever wanted. You're watching Cold Case Desk. If you believe every victim deserves a voice and every case deserves closure, like, comment, and subscribe to our channel. When the news broke in 2023 that the 1962 murder of 9-year-old Carol Ann Dougherty had finally been solved, many people in Bucks County were stunned. For the family, it was the end of an era of grief. For investigators, it was proof that patience and progress can overcome even the deepest silence. But behind the headlines was an extraordinary story, one of scientific evolution, human dedication, and the enduring power of truth. This is how science, time, and a relentless pursuit of answers brought justice to a case more than 6 decades old. In 1962, forensic science was in its infancy. There were no DNA tests, no computerized fingerprints, and no forensic databases to compare evidence. Investigators relied on basic techniques, visual comparison, blood typing, and microscopic analysis of fibers and hair. At the time of Carol Ann's murder, these methods could only suggest possibilities, not prove them. When samples were collected from the crime scene at St. Mark's Church, investigators carefully sealed what they found: hair strands, fibers, and fingerprints, but technology simply couldn't unlock their full story. Still, that evidence would one day become the foundation for solving the case. Those who handled the evidence in 1962 could never have imagined that it would survive long enough to see DNA technology arrive, but thanks to their careful preservation, it did. When cold case detectives in Bucks County reopened the file decades later, they were astonished at how much of the original material had been kept intact. Each envelope, each bag, each sample had been labeled and stored according to the standards of the time. What might have seemed like outdated evidence in the 1970s and 1980s became priceless decades later. Forensic specialists began the slow process of re-examining everything: the clothing, the fibers, and, most importantly, the hair samples collected from men in the Bristol area after the murder. Those samples, 141 in total, represented a community that had been desperate to find a killer, and among them was one belonging to William Schrader. In the early 1990s, forensic labs had developed more advanced methods of comparing hair samples. While still not as definitive as DNA, these techniques could detect microscopic features and match them with a degree of accuracy that was impossible in 1962. When scientists compared the evidence collected from the church to the known samples, one stood out. Schrader's hair was the only one that could not be eliminated. It was a small, almost imperceptible thread, but it was the beginning of the unraveling. Unfortunately, while the finding raised serious suspicion, it wasn't enough for a conviction. The test confirmed consistency but not identity. Without a full DNA profile, the evidence was circumstantial. Still, investigators documented everything. They believed that someday, with better tools, the truth could be proven. Through the late 1990s and early 2000s, DNA analysis advanced rapidly. It became the cornerstone of modern forensic work, solving crimes that had long seemed impossible. But not every cold case benefited. In many older investigations, biological material had degraded too much for DNA extraction. In Carol Ann's case, decades of storage meant that some evidence no longer contained viable genetic markers. Investigators tried multiple times to build a usable profile from what remained of the original samples. Each attempt brought hope, and each ended in disappointment. The DNA simply wasn't there. But while the science couldn't yet provide the answer, human persistence could. Over the years, detectives came and went, each passing the case along with renewed determination. They read through thousands of pages of reports, handwritten notes, and photographs. Each new investigator brought a fresh perspective, but one name kept appearing: William Schrader. He had lived close to the church. He had been questioned. He had lied about his whereabouts, and he had left town soon after the murder. It all pointed to him, but without hard proof, suspicion alone wasn't enough. Still, the Bucks County team refused to close the book. They continued searching for ways to prove what they already believed. In their eyes, justice delayed was not justice denied, not yet. The case might have remained unsolved forever, if not for a single conversation in a small Louisiana town. In 2022, as part of a renewed effort to revisit unsolved murders, Bucks County investigators reached out to anyone connected to William Schrader. Among those they found was his stepson, a man who had lived much of his childhood under Schrader's roof. When detectives asked what he knew, the response was quiet but immediate. The stepson revealed that, years before Schrader's death, he had confessed to killing a young girl in a Pennsylvania church. Schrader had spoken of it not once, but twice, describing it as something that haunted him. He never said the girl's name, but the details matched perfectly. A small church, a little girl, and a night in 1962. For investigators, it was the missing key, the one piece that transformed suspicion into certainty. With this new information, District Attorney Jennifer Shorn made a decision to bring the case before a grand jury. In Pennsylvania, a grand jury can investigate evidence, hear testimony, and determine whether there's sufficient proof that a crime was committed. It's often used in cold cases when justice is long overdue. Over several months, the jury heard from forensic experts, detectives, and witnesses who had lived through the 1960s investigation. They studied the old evidence, reviewed Schrader's background, and listened to the stepson's account of the confession. They also examined Schrader's record of abuse, a history of predatory behavior that mirrored the brutality of Carol Ann's murder. At the end of their review, the conclusion was unanimous. William Schrader was responsible for the rape and murder of 9-year-old Carol Ann Dougherty. On a crisp autumn morning, more than 63 years after the crime, Bucks County officials stood before the press. Cameras clicked. Reporters held notepads. The room was quiet as the district attorney began to speak. She described the decades of work that had gone into the investigation, how each generation of detectives had refused to let the case die. She named William Schrader as the man responsible for Carol Ann's death. There was a collective silence in the room, the kind that only accompanies long-awaited truth. For Carol Ann's sister, Kay, it was the moment she had been waiting for her entire life. She said her family could finally rest, knowing that the truth had been revealed. Justice after death is a strange thing. It brings clarity, but not closure in the traditional sense. The person responsible can no longer face punishment, and the years of loss can never be undone. For the Dougherty family, the discovery brought a mixture of emotions, relief, sadness, and a deep sense of peace. The memories of 1962 never truly faded. For Kay, every passing decade had been a reminder of what her family lost. But now, she could finally say her sister's name with certainty, knowing the truth was no longer buried. For the detectives who worked the case, the announcement was equally emotional. Some had retired, others had passed away, but their efforts had not been in vain. The story of Carol Ann Dougherty would no longer be just an unsolved tragedy, it would be a case closed. The reopening and resolution of Carol Ann's case sparked renewed attention to cold cases across Pennsylvania. It reminded law enforcement agencies of the importance of preserving evidence even when a case seems hopeless. In Bucks County, the district attorney's office began reviewing other unsolved cases from the 1960s and 1970s, searching for opportunities where modern science could bring answers. Each success story serves a greater purpose to honor victims who can no longer speak for themselves. For over 6 decades, Carol Ann had been a name in a file, a photograph in a newspaper clipping, and a whispered memory in the town of Bristol. But through persistence and faith, she became something far more enduring, a symbol of justice that refuses to fade. St. Mark's Church, once a scene of horror, stands today as a place of remembrance. Its walls, silent witnesses to an unspeakable act, now echo with the prayers of those who come to honor her. And somewhere in that quiet town, her story continues to remind people that truth is patient. Sometimes justice isn't about the punishment. It's about the truth. It's about a family who never gave up, investigators who refused to let the case fade, and a community that carried a memory through generations. This case proves that even when decades pass, evidence speaks and truth endures. Soft piano fades to a gentle hum. You're watching Cold Case Desk, where the forgotten are remembered, and the truth is never left behind. If you believe stories like Carol Ann's deserve to be told, like, comment, and subscribe to help keep these cases alive. For the people of Bristol, Pennsylvania, the name Carol Ann Dougherty is more than a headline from the past. It's a reminder of innocence lost, of faith tested, and of a truth that refused to stay buried. When the Bucks County District Attorney finally announced in 2023 that William Schrader had been identified as Carol Ann's killer, something shifted. For the first time in 63 years, The community that had lived under the shadow of her murder could finally breathe. The pain didn't vanish, it never could, but it softened into understanding. Time can be both a healer and a thief. It can dull the sharpness of grief, but it can also steal witnesses, memories, and momentum. For 6 decades, Carol Ann's case sat quietly in boxes and files, carried from one investigator to another. Each generation passed the story along, like a sacred duty. Some detectives took the case home at night, reading reports at their kitchen tables, determined to find what others had missed. Many of them never lived to see the conclusion, but their work, every note, every photograph, every sample preserved, became the stepping stones that led to the truth. And when the grand jury announced its findings, their efforts were finally vindicated. For Kay, the only surviving immediate member of the Dougherty family, the day of the announcement was overwhelming. She was a child when her sister died. In many ways, her life had been defined by that moment in 1962. She often spoke about her sister's warmth, her laughter, her love for the church choir, and her bright spirit. Those memories were frozen in time, unaged and unspoiled, even as the world changed around her. For more than 60 years, she carried her sister's name like a promise. When investigators told her the case was solved, her first words were filled with gratitude. Not joy, exactly, but peace. Kay thanked the detectives and prosecutors who had refused to forget, saying that her family finally had the truth we sought for 6 decades. It wasn't about revenge. It was about acknowledgement. It was about being able to say that Carol Ann's life, though short, mattered, and that her death had not been forgotten. St. Mark's Church stood quietly through it all. Over the years, its bricks had been repainted, its pews refinished, and its stained glass windows restored. But for those who remembered, the church would always carry 2 identities, one sacred, one sorrowful. In the early days after the murder, many families stopped attending. Some left the parish entirely, unable to pray in the same space where tragedy had occurred. The silence in the choir loft was heavy, but when the truth finally came out in 2023, St. Mark's became a place of remembrance once again. Parishioners lit candles, children placed flowers near the altar, and prayers were offered not only for Carol Ann, but for every child whose story had gone unheard. The church had come full circle, from a symbol of fear to a sanctuary of peace. For the Bucks County detectives and prosecutors, the case became a defining chapter in their careers. District Attorney Jennifer Shorn spoke about the importance of never closing a file simply because time had passed. She credited the decades of meticulous record-keeping that made this outcome possible. Evidence that might have been lost or discarded in other jurisdictions had been protected, labeled, and archived. Cold case investigators often work without reward or recognition. Their victories come slowly, sometimes too slowly to celebrate. But when the truth about Carol Ann finally emerged, they shared in a quiet pride. It wasn't about solving a case, it was about honoring a promise. When the news spread through Bristol, reactions were mixed. Some people wept openly, others sat in silence, remembering where they had been on that October day in 1962. Local news stations revisited the story. Residents called in to share their memories. Teachers spoke about the case in classrooms, using it as a lesson in persistence and compassion. Younger generations, who had only heard fragments of the story, finally understood the weight their grandparents carried. In the heart of the town, near the church where Carol Ann's life ended, a small vigil was held. Candles lined the steps. A photo of a smiling 9-year-old girl rested among the flowers. People didn't come for spectacle. They came for closure. Carol Ann's case became a beacon of hope for other families still waiting for answers. It showed that no case is ever truly unsolvable, that even the smallest piece of evidence can someday speak. Law enforcement agencies across the country took note. The Bucks County District Attorney's Office began reviewing other long-dormant files, inspired by what persistence had achieved. Cold case detectives often describe their work as chasing ghosts, but as this story proves, ghosts can be caught. Though William Schrader died in 2002, his name is now part of the historical record. Investigators confirm that his life after fleeing Pennsylvania was marked by violence and control. Reports from family members revealed a man capable of manipulation and cruelty, hiding behind normalcy. He was never tried or sentenced, but his legacy stands as a reminder of how easily evil can disguise itself in ordinary life. Even in death, his story serves a purpose. It warns, it teaches, and it reminds. What stands out most about this story is not the crime itself, but the courage of those who refused to let it fade. The investigators who kept searching, the prosecutors who demanded truth, the journalists who kept the story alive, and the sister who never gave up. Their persistence turned a local tragedy into a story of national perseverance. It's a story of what happens when a community chooses memory over forgetting, and when truth outlasts time. Today, Bristol is a mix of old and new, the same narrow streets, the same waterfront charm, but a renewed sense of purpose. At St. Mark's, the bells ring every Sunday again. The laughter of children fills the streets nearby. The shadow that once lingered has lifted, replaced by remembrance and resilience. For residents, the name Carol Ann Dougherty no longer represents fear. It represents endurance. A small plaque near the church now bears her name, placed there by community members who wanted her story to live on. It reads simply, "In memory of Carol Ann Dougherty, 1953 to 1962. May her light forever guide us toward truth." The reopening of Carol Ann's case sparked a movement in Bucks County. Detectives began re-examining other unsolved crimes, from missing persons to unidentified remains. With modern forensic tools, advanced DNA sequencing, genealogical tracing, and digital databases, investigators now have ways to find connections once thought impossible. Carol Ann's story became a training model in local law enforcement seminars, teaching new detectives the importance of evidence preservation and victim advocacy. Each new breakthrough, they say, is made possible by those who came before, by families like the Doughertys, who refuse to let silence win. Across America, there are thousands of unsolved cases, families still waiting for a name, a confession, a moment of truth. Every time one of those stories finds its ending, it brings hope to the others. For those still waiting, the message from Bristol is clear. Never stop believing that the truth can emerge even after a lifetime, because sometimes the past is only sleeping, waiting for someone to wake it. The murder of Carol Ann Dougherty was one of Pennsylvania's oldest unsolved cases, but it's also one of its greatest examples of perseverance. In a world that often forgets, her story reminds us to remember. Her truth has been told, her memory honored, her family's promise fulfilled. This is Cold Case Desk. If this story moved you, if you believe every victim deserves a voice, like, comment, and subscribe to help us keep these stories alive. It took more than 6 decades, 3 generations of investigators, and a world transformed by science, but finally, the truth about what happened to 9-year-old Carol Ann Dougherty is known. Her name has been restored. Her story, once hidden in the quiet files of a forgotten archive, now lives on in the hearts of those who refuse to stop searching. And even though her killer died long before justice could face him in a courtroom, the truth itself became the verdict her family waited a lifetime to hear. In the fall of 2023, the Bucks County District Attorney's Office announced the grand jury's finding. The room was filled with quiet anticipation. The officials stood behind the podium not to reopen old wounds, but to finally close one that had been left untreated for far too long. The district attorney detailed the long, painful path from that October day in 1962 to the present, the years of investigation, the forensics, the interviews, the confession that broke the silence. And then she said the words that ended more than 6 decades of questions. William Schrader has been identified as the man responsible for the murder of 9-year-old Carol Ann Dougherty. For those in attendance, time seemed to pause. The air in the room was heavy, not with anger, but with relief. The weight of uncertainty had finally lifted. For Carol Ann's sister, Kay, that moment was both heartbreaking and healing. She had been only a child when her sister was taken from her, but she carried that loss for an entire lifetime. Every birthday, every anniversary, every holiday was marked by the same absence. When the announcement came, Kay spoke softly about her gratitude. She said her family could finally rest. The truth had arrived, not in vengeance, but in peace. She thanked the investigators who refused to stop searching, even long after most would have moved on. For her, the answer didn't erase the pain, but it transformed it. It gave meaning to the years of waiting, and it gave her sister's memory the justice it had always deserved. For the detectives and forensic specialists who worked the case, the closure brought a sense of fulfillment that words can barely describe. Many of them had dedicated years, even decades, to bringing light to forgotten cases. They had faced endless dead ends, shifting technology, and files so old they were written on yellowed paper. But when the truth finally came to light, their work stood as a testament to the idea that justice does not expire. In a press statement, District Attorney Jennifer Shorn called it a victory for persistence. She said, "Though nothing can bring Carol back, we can finally let her rest in peace, her truth revealed, and her memory honored." Those words echoed across Pennsylvania, a quiet declaration that time cannot erase truth. Bristol is a small town, but its heart has always been large. Over the decades, its residents carried Carol Ann's memory like a collective scar. For years, the church where it happened stood as a reminder of tragedy, but after 2023, it became a symbol of hope. On quiet evenings, locals now walk past St. Mark's Church and see candles glowing in the windows, a tribute to a little girl whose story changed an entire community. The once unspoken fear that hovered over the town has been replaced with reverence and remembrance. And in the faces of those who lived through it, there is a new kind of peace, the kind that only comes when truth is finally spoken aloud. The case of Carol Ann Dougherty teaches us something powerful about time, truth, and justice. It teaches us that every file, no matter how old, deserves to be reopened. That every clue, no matter how small, can someday tell a story. And that families, even after decades, deserve to know what happened to the ones they love. In many ways, this was never just about one child or one town. It was about a universal promise that no life is too small to matter, and no story is too old to be told. If the investigators of 1962 could see the tools of today, they might not believe their eyes. DNA databases, forensic genealogy, and digital analysis have turned impossibility into possibility. Cold case units across the United States are now using similar methods to revisit crimes once thought unsolvable. Every success, every long-forgotten name, returned to the headlines, is a reminder of the power of progress and persistence. And it all began with stories like Carol Ann's. After the announcement in Bucks County, families from across Pennsylvania reached out to law enforcement, asking about their own unsolved cases. Some of those families were inspired by what they saw, proof that even after half a century, the truth can emerge. Within a year of the Dougherty case closure, 2 more cold cases in the region were reopened for forensic review, each one driven by the same spirit, that answers are still possible. The light from Carol Ann's story didn't just illuminate her own truth, it lit a path for others. It's important to recognize the people behind the headlines, the detectives, analysts, and archivists who kept this case alive. Some were young when they first opened the file, others were nearing retirement, but all shared the same belief that justice is timeless. One investigator described revisiting the evidence like listening to the past speak. Each piece of evidence, every preserved strand, became a voice echoing across generations. And when the grand jury finally confirmed what so many had long suspected, those quiet voices were finally heard. There's a certain irony to solving a case when the perpetrator is already gone. There's no trial, no sentencing, no courtroom drama, but that doesn't mean there's no justice. Justice takes many forms sometimes. It's accountability. Sometimes it's truth. And sometimes it's simply knowing. For the Dougherty family, the confession from Schrader's stepson, the forensic findings, and the grand jury's conclusion were enough. It meant Carol Ann could finally rest. It meant that her story had not been in vain. Carol Ann Dougherty was just 9 years old. She loved to read, to sing, to spend time with friends. She had dreams, small ones, as all children do, of growing up, of exploring the world beyond Bristol's quiet streets. Her life was short, but her legacy is long. Through her story, thousands have been reminded of why truth matters and why every case deserves a voice. Even in silence, she spoke. Even in death, she inspired change. And now, her name lives on not as a mystery, but as a symbol of hope. It took more than 60 years, but the truth finally found its way home. From a small Pennsylvania church to the archives of justice, Carol Ann's story reminds us that time can hide the truth, but it cannot destroy it. Her family waited a lifetime to hear the words that mattered most. And now, with her name cleared, her story told, and her memory honored, they, and all of Bristol, can finally rest. This was the story of 9-year-old Carol Ann Dougherty, whose case, once thought lost to time, was finally solved after 63 years. If this story moved you, if you believe truth, no matter how old, deserves to be told, please like, comment, and subscribe to Cold Case Desk. Your support helps us continue sharing stories that matter, stories of justice, memory, and perseverance. Because as long as we keep telling them, no one is ever truly forgotten. Quick announcement! Channel memberships are now live. Click the Join button below this video to unlock exclusive perks like early access, members-only posts, and priority replies. Thank you for supporting the Cold Case Desk.